For the past years, austerity has been the main battle cry from the part of the forces of capital. All over the world, political and economic elites, along with media pundits, have been singling out public spending, pensions and wages as the main obstacle to economic recovery, calling for budget cuts, deficit reductions, for abolishing the rigidities of the labour market and the privileges enjoyed by public sector employees, for liberalising markets, for removing obstacles to entrepreneurial activity, and, last but not least, for saving banks through a massive redistribution of income towards capital. Of course, the intensity of this attack depends upon the particular conjuncture of its economy, and I think that there is an obvious difference in the extent and scope of the attack in the US and the European Union, and in particular the countries of the Eurozone. In contrast to the American incompletion of the welfare state in the 20th century, along with the extent of American capital's counterattack after the late 1970s, in the European Union, despite the effects of forced market liberalization, privatizations, and labor market reforms, there were still some social gains which European capitalists regarded as an obstacle to profitability. It's interesting to note that the country that has suffered less during the period of the economic crisis, Germany, had been the first to impose aggressive measures of austerity, real wage reductions, and increased flexibility in the first half of the 2000s under social democratic governments. Now, what we tend to define under the generic term austerity, which of course comprises a variety of strategic policies, cannot be understood outside the context of the global capitalist crisis that erupted in 2007-2008, and which was never simply a banking crisis, nor simply the result of a lack of regulation of financial markets or a lack of prudence in public spending. It was a crisis of the regime of accumulation which became dominant after the monetarist, neoconservative and neoliberal counter-revolution of the 1980s, a regime of accumulation that was based upon mass devaluation of fixed capital and unemployment in the first phase, violent changes in the balance of forces with labor, then workplace flexibility, introduction of new technologies, trade and capital flows liberalization, and increased financialization of the economy, which led to the growth of money and capital markets, but also to an aggressive demand for quick returns of capital. It was also a crisis of neoliberalism, a strategy, ideology, and hegemonic discourse since free markets, instead of mechanism of economic rationality, proved to be intrinsically irrational and prone to exacerbating catastrophic economic trends. Finally, in a way, it was a crisis of globalization, since the imbalances of the global system came forward, along with the violence of international money and capital markets. Therefore, we've been witnessing the crisis, the profound crisis of an entire social and economic paradigm. However, until now, the forces of capital have not presented a new social, economic and technological paradigm as a sustained way out of the crisis. They have presented, though, austerity, not only as an immediate boost to profitability, but also as a political strategy for changing the balance of forces through a sort of a fuite en avant tactic or even more aggressive neoliberal reforms. Especially in Europe, austerity and an embedded disciplinary neoliberalism have marked the European integration process from the beginning, even from the 1980s. However, important aspects of the European social models and aspects of a welfare state remain in place. Moreover, despite the ambitious declaration of the Lisbon strategy at the beginning of the 2000s, the European Union lagged in comparison to its competitors in most benchmarks. For the dominant elites in the European Union, the conjuncture of the economic crisis offered the opportunity to impose exactly that kind of violent change they had been looking for, and so they took advantage of the very institutional and financial architecture of the Eurozone. Because participation in the Eurozone means setting aspects of sovereignty, lowering protective barriers against foreign competition, and accepting the priority of European legislation, economic and social policy. And since January 2013, it also implies specific penalties for increased deficits, and formal mechanism of supervision, not only of budget spending, but also all aspects of the economy. Moreover, the introduction of the euro as a single currency, controlled by a supranational central bank, in an economic area marked by divergences in productivity and competitiveness, offered an obvious comparative advantage to the countries of the European core. However, it was also the choice of the economic and political elites of European periphery countries, who thought of this exposure to increased competition without protective barriers as a means of inducing capitalist restructuring and modernization. This kind of monetary union could only increase imbalances. Initially, this could be tolerated because of the flow of relatively cheap credit to fuel consumer spending and property bubbles. But in a period of global economic crisis and subsequent recession, it only made things worse, with trade and current account imbalances also increasing indebtedness. However, to the eyes of the European elites, the sovereign debt crisis of Greece, but also of Ireland, Spain and Portugal, offered a unique opportunity to experiment with a version of shock therapy plus a new and highly original form of induced reduced sovereignty. As a result, bailout loans to deal with sovereign debt crisis were linked to the famous Memorandum of Understanding, and the IMF was called to offer not just financing but also expertise and supervision. According to the strategy of internal devaluation first formulated by IMF chief economist Olivier Balansar, since member states of the European Union cannot use traditional methods of restoring competitiveness, such as currency devaluation, they have to lower both real and nominal wages and change their institutional framework in order to be competitive. The idea was to impose a form of an aggressive social engineering. In the case of Greece, one might say that this became more aggressive than even the IMF's structural adjustment programs of the 1980s. One might say that it is a case where the student becomes more aggressive than the master in imposing the lessons taken. Within 4 years, in Greece, we've seen more than 100 years of labor law being deleted, privatizations, pillages of public assets, market liberalization, and an impressive reduction in real wages, higher educational reforms, abolition of collective bargaining, and lately breaking the taboo of laying off civil servants. This had nothing to do with, improving debt levels or public finances. In reality, since 2010, Greece has plunged into a vicious circle of austerity, recession, unemployment, and debt, compared only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Total recession from 2008 to 2013 has been close to minus 25%, and today, 2014, Greece is still in recession. Unemployment is more than 27%, youth unemployment at almost 60%. Real wages are down by more than 25%, but real spending from the part of employers on wages and contribution is down by 35%, and the debt-to-GDP ratio is at 175%. It was 120% when it was considered to be unsustainable. Now, all this, of course, can only lead to a serious political crisis, especially since, not focused only on the Greek case, the crisis of the neoliberalism as hegemonic discourse means that the bourgeoisies of Europe are incapable of offering any form of a positive hegemonic narrative, apart from the worst has yet to come, or at least we are not as worse off as the Greeks. Now, the political crisis reached the intensity of a hegemonic crisis exactly, of course, in those countries where there were extensive forms of collective resistance. But this is not a Greek exception. I think that we must take care when deciding about political alternatives that since 2010, it is evident, or perhaps since 2008, if we take the Greek December as a sort of a postcard from the future, it is evident that we have entered on a global scale into a new phase of global protest with a particular insurrectional quality. From the struggles in Greece to the Arab Spring, from various students' movements, Britain, Chile, and Quebec, the Indignados movement, Occupy, more recently to the Gezi protest, and many other struggles all over the world. This have also included included, and this is important, symbolic and actual forms of recreating forms of popular unity and alternative public spheres, and they could bring the political crisis exactly to the intensity of hegemonic crisis. The fact that in Greece there is the open possibility of the left reaching political power cannot be explained without reference exactly to this sense of this hegemonic crisis. Now, if austerity is a part of a broader strategy, an attempt to lay the ground for a new, even more aggressive capitalist social paradigm, it is obvious that the challenge is beyond simply resisting austerity. What is needed is a strategy for hegemony, a strategy for power, and a radical social alternative. That is why I suggest that we think in terms of a potential new historical bloc. In my reading, Antonio Gramsci's notion of the historical bloc refers to a strategic, not a descriptive or an analytic concept. It defines not a social alliance, but a social and political condition to be achieved. It refers to the emergence on a broad scale of different forms of politics, different forms of organization, alternative discourses and narratives that materialize an alternative social and economic paradigm. A new historical bloc defines that specific historical condition when not only a new social alliance demands power, but is also in a position to impose its own particular economic form and social strategy and lead society. And I would use a slightly truncated quote from Gramsci. It says, if the relationship between intellectuals and people nation, between the leaders and the led, is provided by a cohesion in which feeling passion becomes understanding and hence knowledge, then and only then is the relationship one of representation. Only then can take place an exchange of individual elements between the rulers and the ruled, leaders and led, and can the shared life be realized, which alone is a social force with the creation of the historical bloc. Now, regarding now social alliances, I think that one important aspect of austerity is that it sort of brings together those people in the precarious, manual, low-wage post to the better educated segments of the workforce, which previously might have been more attached to the ideological support of aspects of neoliberal strategy. It also, through movements, tends to this kind of new original public protest, sort of brings people who were activists plus people who have never taken part into movements. However, it is not just a sociological trend. I think that exactly the differentia specific of the conjuncture has been this series of mass movements and collective practices that have brought together the forces of labor, that have created these material and symbolic forms of popular unity with their horizontal and democratic character, have facilitated a certain reinvention of the people as a collective subject of resistance, solidarity, and transformation. Because without recreating popular unity from below, individual anger and despair can be turned into reactionary and socially cannibalistic, racist, sexist, and far-right directions. One might say that rethinking the notion of the people as a collective subject of transformation is also a way to answer the divisive effects of racism, since instead of imagined communities, it is based on actual communities of struggles, forging an inclusive common popular identity based upon the collective's will to live, work, and struggle within a particular society. I would also like to stress that we can ground this alliance building in basic aspects of the contemporary ontology of labor. Contemporary workforce, despite increased precariousness, fragmentation, new hierarchies, new polarization, is more educated, qualified, skilled than any other previous generation. It has communicative and affective skills that can help it articulate its demands in a more effective way. It can realize its role in the production of social wealth. Therefore, the neoliberal strategy of combining increased education, knowledge, and skills with increased precariousness and reduced wages is in reality an open contradiction in the conjunction. All this offers the possibility also of working class hegemony and an answer to the question what social forces are going to shape the future of our societies. The forces of capital, and in particular finance capital, with its violence, cynicism, and indifference towards people's life, or the alliance of the forces of labor with all their cognitive, intellectual, affective, and creative potential. However, it would be a mistake to take these current aspects of the composition of the labor force as given. Fragmentation, insecurity, precariousness can also have pervasive effects. Therefore, whether these potentialities can take an anti-capitalist direction is a political statement. And now, this means also thinking in terms but also the actuality of a new socialist alternative. Today, in certain cases where the austerity attack is more aggressive, the distance between urgently needed responses to social disaster and socialist strategy is diminished. For example, it is impossible to counter an unemployment rate of 27% without a sharp increase in public spending, plus forms of self-management, plus an increased role of the public sector, plus nationalization of banks and strategic enterprises, and also reclaiming monetary sovereignty. However, all of these are at the same time first steps towards a social strategy. We also need to avoid thinking in terms of people not being ready for radical change. A period of such social crisis, along with the extent of collective resistances, is, even in existential terms, a catalytic experience. This means that people, in reality, are more ready to accept radical solutions than we tend to think. We can also see the same dialectic between urgent needs and strategic targets around one of the main points of ideological blackmail, especially in Greece. The danger of energy shortages since an exit from the Eurozone and a potential correction of the rate of exchange might make energy imports more expensive. Naturally, this would require different priorities for energy consumption, for example, giving priority to mass public transit over private cars, or attempts towards reducing total energy consumption. But aren't these also basic aspects of any attempts towards an environmentally sustainable social strategy? Moreover, today some of the necessary steps towards dealing with the consequences of the crisis, and in particular the acute humanitarian crisis, such as creating networks of solidarity, elaborating new ways to organize aspects of life, such as health education, or just making sure that everyone has access to a proper meal, are not only means to deal with a problem. They are also the learning processes about how things can be organized in a different way. For example, if we have to deal with ways to offer basic health coverage in conditions to reduce access to medical supplies from the international markets, this is a learning process about how to organize a different health system based upon prevention and public health provision instead of expensive medical intervention. Experiments in alternative networks of distribution, such as forms of direct access of agricultural products to consumers, are not simply means to deal with an emergency. They are experiments in finding a solution to the problem of food sufficiency. Self-management is not only a way to deal with firms closing and workers being laid off. It is a necessary experiment in workers' control. But we also have to think in terms of specific, concrete political demands that exactly can bring forward the break with neoliberal capitalist aggression. In my opinion, in the Eurozone, it is impossible to think of a way out of institutionalized austerity without a break from the Eurozone. And claiming of monetary and economic sovereignty is an integral aspect of any attempt towards radical alternative. More generally, demands for delinking for processes of internationalization of capital and from international commodity and money flows are neither a futile exercise in isolation nor a nationalist or sovereignist deviation. I do not think, for example, that any attempt towards socialism can incorporate the current global productive process where it takes the components of a single commercial product to circle twice the globe before it arrives to the final consumer. Some degree of self-sufficiency, decentralization, and locality are indispensable aspects of any new socialist developmental paradigm. Moreover, in contrast to fantasies about a global insurrection or revolution, which in the end can easily turn into reformist calls for a more responsible international community or a more democratic European Union, I think that making the crucial social and political rupture in a potentially weak link remains the most important form of internationalism that would send seismic political waves internationally. In contrast, the inability of the European left to offer a critique of European Union left a space for the far right, which in Europe is mainly pro-systemic and pro-business, we should never forget that, to exploit the anxiety of large segments of subaltern classes regarding European integration. Now, moreover, a strategy for a new historical bloc requires a profound change in ideologies, worldviews and values, and Richard said very interesting things It means that we not tell people that we can bring them back to 2007 or 2009. Instead of an individualistic consumerist ethos, we need a new collective ethos of solidarity, common struggle, and prioritization of real needs. This shouldn't be a top-down, didactic kind of relationship, but an attempt to elaborate upon collective ideological representation that are already present, since people that face austerity have been forced by the very condition to make new ways to make ends meet, to rethink their values. These reactions, these practices are not simply instinctive reactions to the situation, they are embryonic forms of alternative social relations. And there are indeed many traces of communism arising in the margins of capitalist societies, and sometimes not exactly at the margins, from everyday signs of sociality and solidarity to the struggles over public goods, the debates about the commons, and various forms of self-management. Now, the question is, what would be, all this brings us to a question of what it means today a revolutionary strategy, or however grandiose this might sound. I think we have to think it because the question of power remains crucial. It is not possible today to think simply in terms of movements, pressuring bourgeois governments into progressive reforms. In a post-democratic condition, when, for example, the preferred solution in the European Union or the IMF is coalition governments, unelected, you vote for parties, then you see a combination of contrasting parties and perhaps a central banker or prime minister. It is impossible to fight austerity and reverse what's going on without a political break, without, in a way, popular forces arriving at political power. And I think that the emergence of large movements and the hegemonic crisis offer the possibility to combine the attempt towards a government of a left front with a radical socialist program, with a strong movement of self-management, self-organization, and popular counter-power from below. However, this means we do not think simply in terms of change of government, nor it does mean a smooth transition process within the limits of existing legality. It means a process of breaks and transformations, a constituent process of changes and radical reform, the institutional implementation of new forms of large democratic processes, mass democracy from below, increased role of unions and popular assemblies, and participatory democratic planning in a process of experimentation based upon the collective ingenuity of the people in struggle. Because without exactly these forms of popular power from below, any government of the left, and I hope that we will not see this danger in Greece, will be unable to answer the pressures and blackmails from the part of international markets and organizations, and will be led to hope to negotiate austerity with a human face. Because the class character of contemporary states is rooted in their very materiality, and there are going to be strong resistance from the judicial system, coercive state apparatus, segments of the bureaucracy, technocrats, etc. We must never forget that the left is never a party of government. Popular power is always asymmetrical to state apparatuses. And this brings us to the question, we need a new practice of politics, new social forms and political forms of organization, using exactly the lessons in direct democracy, equal voicing and horizontal coordination coming from the movement, to use them to build new unions, new forms of coordination, new forms of community organization, etc. But it also thinking about the political organization. That will be the last point, and I will take advantage of your passions. Now, I think that all this brings together the importance of a renewed thinking of the United Front. I disagree with the traditional interpretation of the United Front as a tactical strategy with social democrats in order to sort of gain back segments of the working class. I think in the minds of Lenin and Gramsci, the United Front was a deeper apprehension of the fact that there is no metaphysics, one class, one party. So it doesn't have that. There is a plurality of class experience, and you need the front experience to bring them together. So I think that it's not about simply connectivity. I do not underestimate the importance of connection or coalition building, but it's beyond. I think that we need to think of the front as the laboratory for this process of recomposition, a political process where different experiences, sensitivities, movements, theoretical elaborations, forms of workers' inquiry, new forms of common sense can converge and be transformed. And I think that we must revisit Gramsci's and also Lenin's conception of the political party as a democratic, political, and theoretical process that does not simply guide the masses. It also produces knowledge of the conjuncture, organic intellectuals, new worldviews, mass political intellectuality, and of course political programs. Consequently, all this has nothing to do with thinking the front as a broad front that is simply the vehicle for revolutionaries to build parties or even worse to recruit members. We must in a way think that today, if the front is the political laboratory, then in a way the modern prince of our times is the United Front. It's not one's organization, however proud we might be of our organizations or historical currents, and this also brings a new dimension to democracy. Democracy is not about having members of a party organization or front have rights. It's not a juridical question, it's about law. It's about exactly being a laboratory, bringing together different exigencies, experiences, however contradictory they might be. You cannot have a front without contradictions, and this is because exactly the situation in society is not unitary. There are differences, there are contradictions, and of course this can never be internal. They are not internal, intermaterial based, so there's no point in having this kind of private-public distinction in political organizing. Last word. Therefore, the responsibility, I think, together of the anti-capitalist left is neither to simply enter broad fronts in order to radicalize them from the inside, nor simply to act as a leftist opposition. I think that the anti-capitalist left must try and think in terms of what should the whole left do, and attempt to construct not the left opposition, but an alternative form of a left-wing front program and strategy. And I think that thinking about a new historical bloc, thinking both in terms of new inclusive social movements, but also new left fronts as laboratories of new political programs. It comprises both the ability to take advantage of the situation in cases of acute hegemonic crisis, but also the passive work of recomposition and realignment. It is at the same time war of position and war of maneuver. It is a way both to exigencies, such as the one facing in Greece or other countries of the European South, but also how to restart radical politics in societies that sort of face the wilderness of neoliberalism. I think that in all cases, we need again to think strategically, even where we're obliged to act partially or locally. In sharp contrast to treating questions of strategy in theoretical or even philological terms, we have the opportunity today to discuss these questions under the pressure of actual historical exigencies and possibilities. We may feel overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge. We may feel tragically incapable to deal with it. We may have to deal with open questions and walk in uncharted territory, but no one ever said that revolutionary politics would be easy. Thank you.